Why is it that some people feel incredibly close to you, share laughs, deep talks, even emotional moments, and still refuse to step into love? Why do they stay in your life, act like you matter deeply, but the moment things become real, they suddenly step back and say, "Let's just be friends"? This is not a rare situation. It happens more often than most people realize, and it leaves behind confusion that slowly turns into self-doubt, overthinking, and emotional exhaustion. Because from the outside, it looks simple. If someone cares, they should love. If someone is close, they should commit. But human psychology is never that simple. Feelings are not always aligned with behavior. And sometimes, the closer someone gets emotionally, the more they feel the need to pull away. There is a hidden emotional pattern behind this behavior that most people misunderstand. It is not always about lack of love. In fact, in many cases, the feeling is there, the connection is real, the bond is felt. But something deeper inside the mind interrupts the natural flow of emotional intimacy. It is the fear of what love demands. Because love is not just comfort. Love is exposure. Love is emotional risk. Love requires vulnerability, consistency, and surrender. And for some individuals, that level of emotional depth activates something inside them that feels unsafe, even if they cannot explain why. So instead of stepping fully into love, they choose something that feels safer, something controlled, something that still keeps you close but not too close. They choose friendship, and this is where the confusion begins. Because friendship feels real, it feels warm, it feels honest. There are moments of care, attention, and even emotional support. It can feel almost identical to love in certain moments, but emotionally, it has boundaries, invisible ones. And those boundaries protect them from feeling overwhelmed. This is not always a conscious decision. Most people in this pattern are not sitting and calculating emotions. It happens automatically. A psychological defense mechanism built over time through past experiences, emotional wounds, or learned fear of dependency. Some people learned early in life that emotional closeness leads to pain. Others experienced inconsistency in relationships. Some felt emotionally overwhelmed when they depended on someone too much. And slowly, the mind adapts. It creates distance as safety. It builds control as comfort. So when real love starts forming, the system inside them reacts, not with excitement, but with tension, because love removes control. Love creates expectation. Love introduces emotional responsibility. And for an avoidant mind, that responsibility feels heavy, not because they do not care, but because caring deeply means they can also be hurt deeply. So instead of stepping forward, they step sideways. They offer friendship. Friendship becomes a psychological compromise. It says, "I want you in my life, but I cannot handle the emotional intensity that comes with more than this." And to the other person, this often feels like emotional confusion because the behavior does not match the feeling. One moment there is closeness, emotional bonding, even signs of deeper connection. And the next moment, a boundary appears that was never expected. This creates an emotional push and pull dynamic. A cycle of hope and withdrawal, closeness and distance, warmth and confusion. And what makes it even more powerful is that the avoidant person is often not trying to hurt anyone. They are trying to protect themselves. But in doing so, they unintentionally create emotional uncertainty in someone who is seeking clarity and stability. The mind of the other person starts to search for answers, overanalyzing every word, replaying every interaction, trying to find the moment where things changed, trying to understand what went wrong. But the truth is often uncomfortable. Nothing went wrong in a visible sense. It is an internal emotional boundary that got triggered. And this is where understanding human psychology becomes powerful. Because once you realize this is not just about behavior, but about emotional fear and protection mechanisms, everything starts to make more sense. It does not remove the pain, but it removes the confusion. And that is important, because confusion is what keeps people emotionally stuck. Not love itself, but the lack of understanding around it. There is also something deeper happening beneath this pattern, a silent conflict inside the avoidant person. A part of them wants connection, wants closeness, wants emotional safety with someone they trust, but another part fears what that closeness might cost them. So they stay in the middle, not fully in love, not fully away, just close enough to feel connection, but distant enough to feel safe. And that is why friendship becomes the default offering. Not because it is all they feel, but because it is all they can manage without emotional overload. And if you have ever been in this situation where someone feels like they are almost yours, but never fully choose you, then what you are about to understand next will change how you see this entire dynamic. Because what seems like rejection is often not rejection at all, it is protection. And the difference between those two can completely change how you interpret emotional distance, silence, and mixed signals. And as this video continues, you will begin to see the deeper layers behind this behavior. The fear, the psychology, and the emotional truth most people never explain clearly. Once you start seeing this pattern as protection rather than rejection, a deeper question naturally rises. If someone can feel connection, if they can share moments of closeness, if they can open up emotionally to a certain level, then why stop right before love begins? Why does the heart move forward while something inside pulls the brakes? This is where psychology reveals a hidden layer that most people never consider, because what looks like inconsistency on the surface is often a conflict happening internally between two powerful human needs that do not easily coexist. On one side is the need for emotional closeness, the desire to feel understood, valued, and connected. On the other side is the need for personal space, independence, and emotional control. For some individuals, these two needs do not blend smoothly. Instead, they compete. And when emotional intensity increases, the mind starts to prioritize safety over connection. Not because connection is unwanted, but because it feels unpredictable. The human brain is wired to avoid emotional states that feel overwhelming or unstable. When something starts to feel too deep, too fast, or too consuming, the nervous system can interpret it as a form of pressure. Even if the situation is safe, the internal reaction may still signal discomfort. This is why some people become distant at the exact moment things start feeling meaningful. It is not logic taking control. It is emotional regulation kicking in. There is also another layer that runs quietly beneath this behavior: identity protection. For certain individuals, emotional closeness creates a fear of losing their sense of self. They do not want to feel absorbed into another person's world. They do not want their decisions, emotions, or stability to depend too heavily on someone else. So the mind creates boundaries before it feels trapped. Friendship becomes that boundary, because friendship allows connection without full emotional exposure. It allows presence without dependency. It allows care without obligation. It becomes a structure where closeness exists, but responsibility remains limited. And this structure feels manageable. But love, on the other hand, removes that structure. Love introduces emotional depth that does not follow strict rules. It grows, expands, and demands openness. It creates expectations, not in a negative sense, but in a natural relational sense. And for someone who is internally wired to protect independence, that can feel like a loss of control. So a quiet internal conflict begins. A part of the mind moves toward connection because it feels good, warm, and meaningful. Another part immediately evaluates the cost of staying in that emotional space. What will this turn into? Will I lose my balance? Will I become too dependent? Will I get hurt if I go further? These are not always conscious thoughts. Often they appear as feelings of discomfort, sudden withdrawal, or emotional numbness when things become too intimate. This is where cognitive dissonance appears. It is the mental tension that happens when emotions and comfort zones do not align. The person may genuinely care about someone, but at the same time feel the need to step back. So instead of choosing between connection and distance directly, they unconsciously choose a middle space. That middle space is labeled as friendship because it reduces pressure, it removes expectation, it allows emotional access without full vulnerability. It also creates an exit path that feels emotionally safe. If things become too intense, stepping back does not feel like a collapse of the entire bond. It feels like a controlled adjustment. But what makes this even more complex is that these individuals often do not feel completely disconnected. In fact, they can experience strong emotional moments, deep conversations, and genuine care. Yet the moment emotional intensity increases beyond a certain threshold, something inside them reacts. It is not a lack of feeling. It is a limit in emotional capacity under perceived pressure. Another important part of this pattern is learned emotional independence. Many people who behave this way have experienced situations where relying on others did not feel stable or safe. Over time, they learn to depend mainly on themselves. Independence becomes not just a preference, but a survival strategy. So when someone starts getting too close, the system that was built for self-reliance activates. It says, reduce dependency, restore control, and distancing becomes the automatic response. This is also why confusion is so common for the other person involved, because from the outside, everything looks emotionally inconsistent. One moment there is warmth, attention, even emotional vulnerability. The next moment there is distance and emotional limitation, but internally it is not randomness, it is regulation. It is the mind trying to stay within a zone that feels safe enough to handle. There is also an emotional paradox here that is difficult to see without understanding psychology. Many avoidant patterns actually involve a strong desire for connection. But the moment connection starts becoming real, it triggers the fear of emotional dependence. So the system keeps switching between approach and retreat, not because the person is unsure about others, but because they are unsure about what happens when closeness becomes too real. And that is why friendship becomes the most comfortable option. It satisfies the need for connection while keeping emotional exposure within controllable limits. It is a balance between wanting and protecting, between reaching out and holding back. And once you understand this internal conflict, the behavior that once felt confusing starts to appear more structured, not easier to experience emotionally, but easier to interpret. Because what seems like mixed signals on the outside is often a consistent survival pattern on the inside. And as this understanding deepens, the next layer reveals something even more important about how emotional safety shapes human connection in ways most people never consciously notice. The deeper layer that follows emotional safety is not just about present behavior. It is about how the mind learned to love in the first place, long before any current relationship even began. Because human connection is not formed randomly. It is shaped through repeated emotional experiences that slowly build internal expectations. Over time, the brain creates a blueprint for what closeness means, what it feels like, and what it leads to. This blueprint is often referred to as an attachment pattern, and it silently influences how someone reacts when intimacy starts to grow. For some individuals, closeness was once paired with unpredictability. Emotional warmth may have existed, but it was not always stable. Sometimes it was present, sometimes it disappeared, and sometimes it came with emotional pressure or unspoken conditions. The mind, especially at a young stage, does not analyze these moments logically. It simply records them as emotional truth. So a message gets stored deep inside. Closeness is not always safe. This is not a conscious belief. It becomes an emotional reflex. Later in life, when someone experiences genuine care or growing affection, that old internal record gets activated. Even if the present situation is healthy, the body and mind respond based on earlier emotional memory. This is why reactions can feel stronger than the current reality. It is not the present moment alone that is being experienced. It is also the echo of past emotional patterns. As this internal system develops, the mind learns a specific strategy: reduce emotional dependency before it becomes overwhelming. Not because connection is unwanted, but because uncertainty once felt uncomfortable enough to be remembered. Over time, this strategy becomes automatic. When emotional intensity rises, the nervous system starts scanning for signs of imbalance. Small things begin to feel amplified. A deeper conversation, a stronger emotional exchange, or increased attention can all be interpreted as signals that things are becoming too involved. And once that internal threshold is crossed, distance begins to feel necessary, not as rejection, but as regulation. At the same time, there is another force working inside: emotional reward. Every moment of connection releases a sense of comfort, familiarity, and even happiness. This is why avoidant patterns are not simple avoidance. They are mixed experiences. Connection feels good, but also feels risky when it grows too strong. This creates an internal push and pull loop. The mind moves toward connection because it is rewarding. Then it moves away because it feels intense. Then it returns again because the bond still exists emotionally. This cycle repeats, creating confusion not only for the other person, but also internally. because the individual is not fully rejecting connection. They are trying to manage how much connection feels manageable at any given time. Another important part of this pattern is emotional self-reliance. Many people who develop this style of relating learn early that depending too much on others can lead to disappointment or instability, so they build strength through independence. They become comfortable handling emotions alone, solving problems alone, and processing internal states without external support. This independence becomes an identity, and anything that threatens that identity can feel uncomfortable. So when a relationship begins to shift from casual connection into deeper emotional territory, it can feel like a silent pressure on that independence. Not because the other person is doing something wrong, but because emotional closeness naturally increases interdependence. At that point, the mind evaluates risk versus comfort. If the emotional demand feels too high, distance becomes the protective choice. What makes this pattern complex is that it is not based on lack of awareness. Many individuals in this cycle are emotionally intelligent. They can understand feelings, express care, and recognize connection. But understanding emotions is not the same as tolerating emotional intensity. This is where emotional regulation becomes the key factor. The system is not struggling with feeling. It is struggling with sustained closeness under emotional load. Another layer that strengthens this behavior is reinforcement. Every time distance creates relief from emotional pressure, the brain registers it as a successful solution. The discomfort decreases, control returns, and stability feels restored. This teaches the mind that stepping back works as a coping method. Over time, this becomes a default response without conscious planning. So even when love is present, even when connection is valued, the protective response activates automatically under emotional intensity. This is why the offer of friendship becomes so common in such dynamics. It allows the bond to remain alive while keeping emotional exposure at a level that feels manageable. It preserves connection without activating internal overwhelm. But beneath this structure, there is often a quiet contradiction, because removing emotional depth does not remove emotional capacity. It only limits expression. The feeling still exists, but the expression is controlled. And this creates internal tension over time. One part of the mind seeks deeper connection because connection is naturally rewarding for human beings. Another part prioritizes emotional stability and control because that has been learned as necessary for safety. So the person does not fully move forward and does not fully step away. They remain in a regulated middle state. What appears confusing externally is actually a consistent internal system trying to balance two competing needs: attachment and protection. Understanding this does not simplify the emotional experience, but it changes the interpretation of it. It shifts the focus from blame or misunderstanding toward recognition of internal emotional programming, because what feels like distance is often a structured way of maintaining balance inside a system that associates intensity with risk. And once this psychological layer becomes clear, the next question naturally arises. What does this mean for both sides of the connection, and how does this pattern continue shaping emotional experiences in real-life interactions? When this internal balance becomes a repeated pattern, it does not stay hidden inside one person alone. It starts shaping the emotional experience of both individuals involved in the connection. Because relationships are not one-sided systems, they are emotional exchanges where each reaction influences the other side. At first, the dynamic feels hopeful. There is attention, communication, shared moments, and emotional familiarity building over time. The connection seems to be moving forward naturally, but then subtle changes begin to appear. Response timing shifts, emotional openness becomes less consistent, physical or emotional distance starts to increase without clear explanation. This is where confusion usually begins to grow. The mind on the receiving side tries to find a logical reason. It starts reviewing conversations, looking for mistakes, searching for signs that something changed. This is a natural human response. The brain is wired to seek patterns, especially when emotional stability is disrupted. But in this situation, the pattern is not external. It is internal to the other person's emotional system. That is why answers are not easy to find through observation alone. As uncertainty continues, emotional attachment often increases instead of decreasing. This happens because of a psychological principle where inconsistency strengthens focus. When rewards are unpredictable, the brain becomes more engaged, not less. Moments of closeness feel more intense because they are not stable. This creates a stronger emotional pull, so even when distance appears, emotional investment can grow. At the same time, the person who is emotionally withdrawing is also experiencing an internal shift. They may still care, they may still feel connected, but the presence of emotional expectation or perceived intensity begins to feel heavier than before. The system that once felt comfortable starts to feel overstimulated. This creates internal pressure, and when pressure rises, the instinct is to reduce it. The result is a gradual step back into a more controlled form of connection. Communication may become less expressive, emotional topics may be avoided, interaction may shift toward lighter or more neutral exchanges. This is not necessarily a decision made with clarity. It is often an automatic adjustment toward emotional comfort. From the outside, this appears as mixed behavior. From the inside, it is a search for stability. But the person on the receiving end experiences something very different. They experience uncertainty, because the emotional pattern they are receiving does not follow a stable direction. There are moments of closeness that suggest potential, followed by distance that creates doubt. This combination creates cognitive strain. The mind struggles to form a clear conclusion. It keeps oscillating between hope and confusion, between interpreting connection as meaningful and questioning whether it is real. This internal conflict can become emotionally exhausting over time. Another important factor in this dynamic is the difference in emotional pacing. One side may be moving toward deeper attachment, while the other is regulating intensity to avoid feeling overwhelmed. This mismatch in pacing creates a natural imbalance in expectations. When emotional speed differs, misunderstanding increases. One person may feel that things are developing. The other may feel that things are becoming too fast. Neither perspective is wrong in itself, but the difference in internal experience creates tension between expression and withdrawal. This tension often leads to silence at key emotional moments. Silence in this context is not absence of feeling. It is often a form of emotional pause, a moment where the internal system tries to regain control, reduce stimulation, and restore equilibrium. However, silence is interpreted externally in multiple ways. It can feel like rejection, uncertainty, or emotional withdrawal. This interpretation deepens emotional stress for the person seeking clarity. As time passes, both individuals begin adapting to the pattern. One adapts by increasing emotional effort, trying to reconnect or stabilize the bond. The other adapts by limiting emotional exposure to maintain comfort. This creates a cycle where one moves closer and the other steps slightly away. Without awareness, this cycle can continue indefinitely because each action is a response to the previous one, not always a reflection of true emotional intention. It becomes a reactive loop rather than a conscious choice. Within this loop, emotional truth becomes harder to identify. Feelings exist, but they are filtered through protection mechanisms, expectations, and fear responses. What is expressed outwardly does not always match what is experienced inwardly. This gap between internal emotion and external behavior is where most confusion originates. Understanding this gap is important because it changes how emotional distance is interpreted. Instead of seeing it as a simple decision to disconnect, it becomes a layered response shaped by internal regulation, learned emotional patterns, and sensitivity to intensity. At this stage, the connection is no longer just about two individuals. It becomes a reflection of two different emotional systems trying to coexist within the same space. One system seeks consistency and depth, the other seeks stability and controlled engagement. Neither system is inherently wrong, but when they interact without awareness, friction naturally appears. This friction is often what people describe as emotional confusion, inconsistency, or mixed signals. But beneath those labels, there is a structured psychological process attempting to balance connection with emotional safety. And when this understanding becomes clearer, the focus shifts away from trying to decode every action and moves toward recognizing the pattern itself. Because patterns reveal more truth than isolated moments ever can. And as this awareness develops, the next layer begins to show something even more important about what happens emotionally when this cycle continues over time and how it silently shapes expectations, attachment, and personal emotional resilience.